Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture, arranged by the Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm your host, Naeem Mahmood. Tonight, we are to have our second lecture on the series, The Crash of Civilization, the History and Future of Western Modernity, and the Islamicate. The series consists of 4 lectures, which will be delivered on a fortnightly basis. The aim of the series is to understand modernity better and also how it affected the Islamicate. The title of tonight's lecture is The Islamicate's Encounter with Western Modernity, Colonialism, Imperialism, Subjugation, and Decolonization. The lecturer tonight is Professor Saeed Khan. Saeed Khan is Associate Professor of Teaching in the Department of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan, where he teaches Islamic and Middle East history, politics, and culture, and where he is also Director of Global Studies. His primary area of research is the identity politics of Muslim diaspora communities in the USA, UK, and Europe, and assessment of Western modernity and its discontents. He is also a research fellow at Wayne's State Center for the Study of Citizenship and is a founding member and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, which is a Washington-based think tank. Professor Saeed Khan's most recent publications include the 2021 anthology, Global Studies, a research on issues and institutions, the co-authored 2020 book, What is Going On Here? US's Experience of Islamophobia Between Obama and Trump, and Fallacies of Foundational Principles, Rawls's Political Liberalism and Islamophobia in Reorient, March 2017. So this is about the intro of tonight's lecture. Now we'll go straight to the lecture, but before that, let me inform you that we have our formats. We have the format, let me introduce it to you as well. We start with the introduction, which I have just done. And next we'll go straight to the lecture, which will last around 30 to 45 minutes. And then the lecture will be followed by Q&A, which will last around 30 to 45 minutes as well. So we observe few rules. We ask our audience to keep mic and mobile muted until told otherwise. We also encourage questions and comments, maintaining professional approach. We also encourage the attendees to take notes on the lecture for the comments and Q&A section. So that's about the format and intro of tonight's lecture. Now we'll go straight to the lecture, and Professor Saeed, it's over to you now.
Excuse me. Okay, thank you so much, Naeem. Assalamu alaikum, and good evening to you all, wherever you might be in the world tonight. And thank you for joining us in today's lecture. For those,
sorry to interrupt you. About the presentation, do you like to present the slides?
Yes, please.
Yeah, go ahead then, please.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who are returning, thank you for joining us again for the second in the 4-part series, which is hopefully a deeper dive into understanding Western modernity. So I'm just going to go ahead now, if you permit me, and bring up my slides. Okay. So when we're thinking about colonization, and I know one of the questions that is a very reasonable one to ask is, was there colonization prior to the 15th century? And did it occur by non-Western entities? I mean, obviously, with our principal area of study here looking at the Islamicate or the Muslim world, can it be said that Muslims also engaged in colonization? Because I think it's important for us to then be very careful that we're not entering into an area of hypocrisy, of critiquing one particular narrative without fairly going ahead and examining it by ourselves. Particularly when, of course, there then becomes the criticism that comes back to us in today's day and age where the term whataboutism is so prevalent. But what I'll do is I'll hold off on assessing the Muslim world and its possible ventures into colonization until the end. Maybe it can be part of our discussion in the Q&A session. What I'd like to do, though, is at least set up some of the characteristics of Western modern colonization. What were its causes? What were its motivations? And then, of course, what were its consequences? And if you remember last time, we talked about how Western modernity really is identified as a phenomenon which begins in the latter part of the 15th, early part of the 16th century. So really around, say, 1500, give or take a few years. We mentioned how, of course, the fall of Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, at the hands of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, played a very instrumental role in serving as a catalyst for not only transitions in Western Europe, the advent of what then became this movement toward modernity as we understand it today, facilitated and catalyzed by the Protestant Reformation. But it also then led into what is sometimes known as the Age of Discovery. Put in another way, really the age of colonization. And of course, it was in 1492 that the so-called Americas, although they were erroneously considered to be the Indies by those who were involved, were allegedly discovered. Well, obviously they were already there, and now scholarship shows that there were several encounters and more positive engagements with the peoples of the Americas predating Columbus. Columbus reaches the island of Hispaniola in 1492. The island today is the home of both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But this narrative of conquering the New World is very central to the idea of colonization, because what it then presumes in this narrative is that the people were not fully civilized, and either needed to be civilized or needed to simply be moved out of the way, suggesting that they were perhaps even less than human. And the other idea is that once you dehumanize a people, it is then very easy to say that it is a new world, it is an uncharted world, it is a clean, virgin world that is just simply ripe for the taking. And so here we see a graphic of the Spanish conquest coming to a rather naive and at least initially welcoming peoples. So then what are the needs for colonization, sort of in the more abstract? Well, what we find particularly in the Western modern construct of colonization, but I wouldn't say that it's limited to that, is control. And in this case, we find particularly the control over raw materials, as well as the creation of new markets. So one of the things that we talked about last time was the central features of Western modernity and the idea of creating a market economy, the very early seeds of what we would now describe as capitalism. Early on, economies were by and large subsistence economies. You grow and you make what you need, and maybe a little bit of surplus that you can trade for goods that you yourself are not producing. But now there was this idea about mass production, and especially when there was the prospect of having access to and control over large amounts of raw materials. This then means that somebody can become a producer, and perhaps more a producer than even a consumer of goods. And I think it's important to recognize then that when we're looking at the motivations of colonization, and I think that most of us here on this particular conversation will recognize that colonization for those that were colonized was not seen as a very positive development. There are, of course, now many conversations occurring, which is fascinating, to provide a kind of a revisionist history of the narrative of colonization. Questions and debates abound that perhaps colonization wasn't that great, but it still had a net positive effect on those who were colonized. And case in point for this is arguments that are made in British debates about whether colonization was ultimately and eventually a net positive for India. It does not matter that, of course, India was essentially pillaged for about $45 trillion worth of wealth as a result of the colonial project. But of course, India has a railway system and a civil service that are enviable. So basically that then justifies colonization. Again, I'm sure that you are probably privy to some of those discussions and debates, and I certainly welcome hearing from you what have been your experiences about it. But it becomes very easy to then place value judgments on colonization, where, as I've said, on the one hand, there is this effort to exculpate or to make blameless the colonizer. And there is also the very reasonable response from the colonized to say, well, colonization was actually a very evil project, applying a kind of a moral code to it. I'm of the mind that when colonization did begin within the Western modern project, I'm not sure that Europe and the West really understood all of the dynamics of colonization. It was almost a kind of runaway train that the allure of seeing the access and the potential for raw materials then takes on a life of its own. I would actually suggest that colonization in some ways had less to do with the colonized when it comes to the motivation for it than it did the competition among European rivals. The evil that occurs, the brutality, the negative aspects of colonization are indisputable. But as far as if we're looking at the impetus, it's perhaps redolent of the movie The Godfather, where it said it's not personal, it's strictly business. That seems to at least be at the inception what was driving colonization among Western powers. There are two basic kinds of colonization. There is the exploitation and extraction colonization, or colonialism, where this would probably be most suited to understanding European colonization in the form of taking raw materials, removing people, either through deportation or through genocide. This would have been certainly the case in the Americas. But where you find then Europeans moving in and not just using these territories to extract materials, then you have what's known as settler colonialism. Perhaps the best example of that, interestingly enough, yesterday being Australia Day, also known as Invasion Day down under, is this idea of a group of people coming in, again with the conceit that this is our land, and that perhaps even despite the fact that there may be native peoples there, it is unsettled, and the people are, as they were in Australia until 1969, considered to be part of the flora and the fauna of the land. So it's important to recognize these two different kinds of colonialism that have existed. Now, when we talk about the Americas and the experience there, I think it's also important to recognize a different element of colonialism, and that is the movement of peoples. And this movement, of course, does not happen with any volition or voluntariness. Here we have an example of the Atlantic slave trade, where slaves are uprooted from Africa and then brought to the Americas to work. And the numbers, as you see, are staggering. And the only thing that's more staggering than the numbers who reached the shores are those who perished on the journey. These are numbers that really cannot be accurately verified or even, I think, fathomed and comprehended such that they were. It's also important to realize that the slave trade did not just go in this direction. In the Asian side of the equation, we have, for example, the Dutch, who in the 17th century then enslave many of the Malay people and bring them down to South Africa and establish them there as part of this forced labor. The descendants of those slaves are known as the Cape Malay. And in fact, if you go to Cape Town and if you go to the district of Bo-Kaap, you will see the descendants of former slaves within the Dutch colonies that are settled there. Other groups were moved as indentured labor, and others were incentivized to move, usually within the imperial territories that were there. And here you see the Great Triangle, of how then this colonial project would work and how it then brings untold wealth to Western Europe. Here's an example, of course, using Great Britain, where slaves are brought to the Indies, manufactured goods and other raw materials make their way to Great Britain, and then end products are then sold back to many of these areas, as I said before, by creating new markets. In the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, it was primarily just pillaging the raw materials like sugar, molasses, gold, and other commodities from there. It was, as you see, the number of countries and from where they originate, really a European project to colonize particularly the Americas. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the British, the Russians, and the Dutch all had a hand and a stake in this area. And of course, the Americas were only one region of the world. Africa and Asia were not immune to this process. I think this graphic is very telling in trying to understand both colonial attitudes as well as European imperialism. As I mentioned, in many ways, it was all about the rivalries that each of these European countries had with one another. Last time we talked about the 30-year wars, these rather malevolent religious-based wars in Europe. And I think it's important to recognize that despite the fact that they came up with their own ceasefire in the year 1648, that did not deter Europeans to still fight. They just simply decided to fight elsewhere. And so these rivalries then were about trying to carve up the global map into territories, into spheres of influence, and in some cases, exclusive zones of trade, commerce, and control over peoples and product. So here we see the Russians and the British Lion trying to fight over the Chinese dragon. And then, of course, you see other countries there, for example, the American eagle to the left. You see the Austro-Hungarian Empire also trying to make a claim as scavengers or vultures. This was actually fairly representative of the attitudes that Europe had with one another. And part of that was a kind of anxiety. On the one hand, I think you'll appreciate that as we've been talking about Western modernity, as it then develops, was supposed to be a liberating idea. It was supposed to be a civilizing idea. It was supposed to move the individual toward a greater sense of security, safety, and freedom from anxiety. And at the same time, we find that the reality was anything but that. There was always an underlying anxiety. There was almost a paranoia that existed, which always seems to be counterintuitive when someone is at least making the claim that what they have or what they're aspiring to is more stabilizing. In order to understand Western colonialism at this time, and particularly imperialism, which is its handmaiden, we have to consider this other revolution that happened, the Industrial Revolution. The British historian Eric Hobsbawm had said that in the late 18th century, there were two main revolutions that occurred. And I always like to present this as a question or as a quiz to my students. They intuitively will say the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Well, Hobsbawm said actually there was, those were not exactly right. The two revolutions that he was talking about were revolutions in economics and revolution in politics. In economics, in 1776, there was the publication of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is considered to be sort of this founding document of understanding free market economies. And it was also the year that Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, which then started the ball rolling on the prospect of moving away from monarchies and tyrannies. In the United States, that happened with the American Revolution and War of Independence. And in France, 13 years later, in 1789, the complete dismantling of the old system of the monarchy and the three estates. So this idea then about how Europe was reconfiguring set the stage then for how colonialism and imperialism now could be used as a way to feed and fuel what happens next. And that is industry becoming the dominant force in producing and guiding economics, moving from an agricultural-based system to an industrial-based system. And even agriculture then becomes industrialized. Eli Whitney with the cotton gin, factories and mass production, as here we have textiles, instead of just simply hand labor, mass production, 24-hour production. It completely changes Europe and Europe's consciousness when it comes to the kind of social engineering. You know, we don't think about it so much, but think about a place like England, and especially in the North, the complete change of societies from people who worked in a feudal system, worked on the land for a feudal landlord, now starting to move into factories. Now you're finding the development of a bourgeois class of merchants, instead of just simply having the aristocrats and the noble class and people who worked on the land. You have people who are becoming entrepreneurs. One of the most famous cases, of course, is a man by the name of Cadbury, who establishes in Birmingham, England, a chocolate factory. So this then changes the way that Europe perceives itself. And at the same time, it develops an insatiable appetite for things it cannot produce itself, like cotton. It then makes the Europeans not only seek to buy and control cotton from elsewhere, the Americas, Egypt, and elsewhere, but also to use these places as markets for their their manufactured products. After all, you're producing so many shirts in a textile factory in Lancashire, England. No one can buy all of those shirts in England, so you need to create new markets for them in these other places, and perhaps equally importantly, keeping your rivals, your competitors, other European countries out of it. Some of you may be familiar with this, that the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning that there was no time zone that did not have a British colony or protectorate there. And of course, this meant that England was the dominant force in the world of colonialism and imperialism for its sheer reach and the ability to then have an unparalleled level of access to raw materials, often to the expense of other European countries. One of the ways that modernity then in some ways converges between the West and the Islamicate is over the Suez Canal. In 1869, after 10 years of construction, led by a man by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a Frenchman, we have this canal which now for the first time in human history links by water the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and onwards to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, cutting almost in half the voyage time between London and Western Europe and Asia and farther afield in East Asia. This meant more efficiency with raw materials reaching. It also meant that you didn't have as much spoilage of goods. One of the interesting things about the Suez Canal is, and here's a point made by Miss Caligara, and the chocolate needed sugar to make it, which required slavery. Absolutely right. Here you have, by modern terms, the canal was still very cheap to make. It was only 1.7 billion. I think many sports arenas cost about that much these days, but it didn't have any locks. So it was a much easier canal to make than, say, the Panama Canal. Of course, just to show you about the rivalries, first of all, Egypt, led by Shah Ismail at the time, said, wonderful. Egypt now is a major stakeholder in the modern world. Look at this wonderful engineering feat made by Egyptian laborers, designed by a Frenchman. It will help make Egypt indispensable. Of course, he couldn't pay back the debt on the loan for the Suez Canal. And in 1875, much to the anger of the French, the Egyptians sell the Suez Canal to the British. So now the British control the Straits of Gibraltar, and they control the Suez as well, access to 2 of the 3 areas in and out of the Mediterranean. We also, of course, have the link now with the Suez Canal with another great imperial area for the British, the jewel in their crown, which of course was India. And here we see an example of what India was like during the Mughal period, from the 16th century until the development of British rule over there. I think it is vital. Someone asked earlier about like what would be a good reading list for people to understand some of these themes and topics. I would strongly recommend William Dalrymple's excellent book, The Anarchy, which is essentially a biography of the British East India Company, the first real corporation in world history, and one which has had a far more profound impact than we even consider. I mean, today, of course, we think of it as being this odious force in British Indian history, but the whole notion of the corporatization of commerce, as well as the relationship between the corporation and the sovereign state, really begins here with the British East India Company, how it made a foothold before Great Britain did as a sovereign nation. It had its own private army. It had a mutiny in this army in 1857. And then finally, the company, quote unquote, hands over to Great Britain, the sovereign state, India. But in essence, the question really is whether it was the dog wagging the tail or whether it was the tail wagging the dog. And here we see Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, being very ignominiously led out by the British in 1857, and the end of the Mughal period there, and the start of British rule, as we see. Again, there were rivalries. When it comes to understanding Western modernity, it really is a saga of Western nations. Here we find little vestiges of Portuguese power in Goa. Actually, the Portuguese had a lot more control over India at one time. And then you have the city of Pondicherry, which was a French controlled area. The British were quite effective, along with the British East India Company before them, in quelling their European rivals in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the question that we oftentimes happen is, what were Muslims doing about this rise of modernity as they were now encountering it? Because let's face it, as the expressions of modernity were being defined as colonialism and imperialism, at least in its outward expression, and what was being then witnessed and experienced by those who were colonized, a lot of the territory happened to be Muslim territory or territory within the so-called Islamicate, whether it was the Ottoman Empire, whether it was the Mughal Empire, to a lesser degree the Safavid Empire in Persia, or in areas which were perhaps not under direct Muslim imperial rule, but still were majority Muslim or predominantly Muslim areas. The question is, did they not see this coming? And what did they, if anything, do about it? Well, the Muslim world was not fiddling while Rome burned. I think that unfortunately, that's a rather Orientalist trope that's put out there, to think that Muslims were either too stupid or too lazy or too decadent or too oblivious to see what was coming. In fact, there were many scholars who were quite well aware of what was coming. And in fact, they were quite forward thinking in what were their consequences. The problem, of course, then comes with how big, how bulky, and how the issue of where do you start when you are hemorrhaging in so many places? By the time Europe is now on the ascent, well past the 17th century into the 18th century, the dominant empire in Asia and Europe was the Ottoman Empire, and it was now on its decline. It had peaked by 1683 with an attempt to try to invade Austria. It failed. And then what we find is a kind of confidence that starts to build up in Europe, that maybe the Ottoman Empire is not as tough, maybe it is not as impregnable or as invulnerable as we thought it was. Their successes through colonization with the use of new weaponry was something that was now being trained against the Ottomans. It was also being trained against the Mughal Empire in India, and to a lesser degree, by way of the Russians and the British in Persia. But intellectually, there were people who were wondering, we have three options. We either accept the status quo and just let the West run right over us. There were, of course, others who were in complete denial, who thought, well, this is a passing thing. We have our own strengths, and we will be able to withstand this. And then there were others who were looking to find some kind of middle ground, to say that we clearly aren't well equipped to stave off what are the forces that are now coming at us very directly. Maybe we need to then understand modernity as it is a Western project, see if there's any merit in some things that it has to offer, and what can we then go ahead and jettison. In other words, to use an example or a metaphor in food, to see if it's a fixed menu or to see if it's an a la carte menu. And here are three individuals who all happen to be in Egypt and who happen to be chancellors or rectors of Al-Azhar, the predominant and preeminent seminary, especially of Sunni thinking in the Muslim world. You have Jamaluddin al-Afghani, you have Muhammad Abdu, and you have Rashid Rida, who were in succession the chancellors of Al-Azhar. Afghani was someone who believed in unity and action. He saw that there were elements of modernity that should not be dismissed. He saw that there are aspects of it which can be and are in fact compatible with Islam. But he said there needs to be a cautious approach, particularly because of the way it was being imposed on the so-called Muslim world. He professed the idea of unity and action, that if the Muslims are united and if they take on a proactive engagement with modernity, they can then retain the agency to decide which items to select and which items are perhaps not very good for the Islamicate. Muhammad Abdu, who succeeded him as the Chancellor of Al-Azhar, took on a much more cautious approach. For him, it was about focusing on reestablishing and reforming the institutions within Islam in order to protect them from being overrun by the West. There was a lot of coercion at this time by Europeans to impose legal systems, political systems, economic systems, as well as immunity from liability, from tax payment, as well as diplomatic immunity for anyone who was working or doing business in Muslim lands. These were known as capitulations. And it really shows, unfortunately, how the power dynamic had shifted in favor of the West compared to the Muslim world at this time, that they were not able to even resist those demands. So Abdu is looking at more self-reflection than Afghani, who was looking at things perhaps more proactively. And Rashid Rida takes on an approach which arguably could be seen much more as a fundamental approach. We may not be able to do anything about modernity, but we can try to protect Islam and our core Islamic values. The only way to really do that, in his mind, were to double down on a much more fundamentalist approach. Of course, this was welcomed by those who would identify as being Salafi, even Wahhabi. But again, insularity is just one of a series of different approaches, and one that was by and large discounted by others. There were other movements, for example, There was the Sanusi movement in North Africa, a community that decided that they were going to simply cut off from all of these other worldly elements and try to live a life which was modeled around the 7th century Medina, to use the prophetic example. It was mildly successful, but again, imperialism was something that was simply too strong. In the Indian subcontinent, there were two different ways of dealing with the onslaught of imperialism and colonialism. One was taken by a man who said, look, we have to realize that this is the new zeitgeist, the new prevailing and dominant spirit in the world, the new power core. And he says, if you can't beat them, join them or emulate them. Let us go ahead and learn the new languages of Europe. Let us learn the new curricula of Europe. Let's learn how to think like them, and therefore we can at least go toe-to-toe and even be competitive. And he decided to open up a university which was modeled on the Western curriculum and even the Western architecture. And this, of course, was the Anglo-Occidental Mohammedan College, better known as Aligarh University. And the gentleman is, of course, Sir Saeed Ahmed Khan. No relation. The other model in India at this time was to say, no, we need to protect and preserve Islam. And this then became, of course, the Darul Uloom in Deoband. It's important to see that both of these were responses to Western modernity as it was being experienced and as it was being encountered in the subcontinent. Here we see an example of how totalistic colonialism was in a place like Africa. In the latter part of the 19th century, there were still a lot of areas which were kept immune from colonial extent. By the time the 20th century was right before the advent of World War I, it was almost completely colonized, with the exception of Ethiopia, I think Equatorial Guinea, or is that Gabon, and Western Sahara. And then, of course, during World War I, you see how much of the world is under the yoke of Western colonialism and imperialism. So much so that political activity was suppressed in places that were under colonial rule. We see here a graphic of 1936, and similarly, there is an awful lot of colonization, but then some relaxation after World War II, not because of some kind of moral epiphany or realization that the West had. They just simply couldn't afford to hold on to colonies anymore and essentially held a yard sale, which in some ways we would call decolonization. So here's a graphic which I thought was really interesting. Here you see, in the case of a British cartoon, sending a British official to the colonies. Good luck, boy, go out and seek your fortune. And then in the era of decolonization, those who were colonized now having to face the realization that if they want to go anywhere in the world, they need to learn from their former masters. They need to go to Britain, because the economic condition, the political condition, the cultural condition that the colonizers had left the colonies in was untenable. So this then becomes another irony and another facet of how Western modernity was experienced. Here we see an example that sometimes isn't really regarded as decolonization, but there's no other way to describe it, and that is the independence and then the partition of India in 1947, and how it was so brutal and how it was such an upheaval. But that was not the only place where you see this process of decolonization being utterly violent. Here we see the rather brutal 8-year-long Algerian War of Independence, which came in the aftermath of the French realizing that they could not hold on to Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They handed that over to the Americans, who then had to deal with Vietnam for the next 21 years. But here you find 60 years on, a a scar that still exists both in Algeria as well as more broadly in North Africa, and I would argue even in France itself. In fact, some of you are probably familiar with the whole field of postmodernism and postmodern literature. Many of the main figures in postmodernism, people like Michel Foucault, people like Claude Lévi-Strauss, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Jacques Derrida, all of them were shaped, and some would even argue scarred, by what they saw as the hypocrisy and the contradiction of the Algerian War of Independence. If France was supposed to be so refined, if it was supposed to be so enlightened, if it was espousing these values of liberty, equality, fraternity, if it was the birthplace of the Enlightenment, then why was it doing the exact opposite in its treatment or its mistreatment of the Algerians? So those kinds of internal conflicts were starting to be realized, and they were being intellectualized by the new breed of European philosophers. Well, decolonization was a process which really continued. And you see here, of course, without much coincidence, how much of the region was part of the so-called Muslim world. It would be malpractice and irresponsible not to mention oil. Oil being a commodity, of course, one that led to both colonialism as well as imperialism, and some would argue that it persists to this day. The only question, though, is whether that is a function of Western modernity being manifested by the sovereign state, or is it Western modernity by the outcome and consequence of its values like capitalism, etc., which is the corporation. Again, I'll leave that for you to go ahead and ponder. Now, the Cold War was a period of course, decolonization. But if we were to believe that this was true liberation, and particularly the liberation that Western modernity has always claimed is a central feature to its identity and a universal trait that should be and can be and ought to be experienced by people all over the world, that didn't happen. In fact, because of the Cold War between the United States and Western powers and the Soviet bloc, Muslim countries as well as others in the so-called third world were made to choose a side. And if they didn't choose wisely, they were forced into choosing a side by one or the other power. Which brings us then to this other idea of colonialism, which is neocolonialism. And here you see a rather poignant graphic of how Europe and America both got wealthy at the expense of leaving Africa completely empty. And so the question then becomes that is the new expression of Western modernity after colonialism, after decolonization, is it now neocolonialism? Of course, when we're looking at this, we're living in a time and in a world where perhaps neocolonialism is not limited to just Western Europe or the West itself. With the rise of China, it is quite possible that we're going to find that colonialism will take on a new expression. But if it takes on a new expression, will it then have the same characteristics and the same defining features as did the Western modernity project that bore colonialism? So if we're taking a look at a checklist, when it comes to the characteristics of modernity, and this graphic will hopefully look familiar to you from last time, because, well, quite frankly, it's the same slide as last time, but it has been amended. The features of modernity as the West has defined itself, and looking at it when it comes to those who experienced colonialism as then a manifestation of Western modernity. So if you were colonized, did you experience market economy? Well, yes. That's the good news. The bad news is it was just simply serving as a producer of raw material for imperial states. Did the West allow colonies to have a public sphere? No. Public expression, particularly that which challenged their rule was sometimes severely suppressed. Did it allow for a self-governing people? Of course not. The very definition of colonialism. Did it allow for secularism to exist? The argument is that actually, not only did the West not permit secularism, they in fact encouraged sectarian politics as a way to justify divide and rule and to justify their presence to be there in the colonies as a so-called neutral third party to arbitrate among people who seemingly couldn't get along. This was particularly the case in the Mandate period of the Middle East between World War I and World War II. Did it allow for democracy in the colonies? No. And did it allow for liberalism in the colonies? No. In fact, what was interesting is that this paradox where the features of modernity, oftentimes promoted as being universal, were anything but that in order to then maintain, perpetuate, and profit from the modern project as it was then experienced by the Muslim world and others in a similar situation. With that, I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Professor Saeed. Thank you so much for the presentation and the lecture. I think you beautifully outlined the inception of colonialism. So Saeed, let me start with the question that I have for you. I try to look at the whole topic in two ways, basically. The first one is about understanding the colonial mindset. I mean, how did the European came about with the idea to control and subjugate the other, if you say that. So yeah, I mean, if you could shed some light on that would be really helpful. For example, when I studied, I found out that at the core of the Western philosophy or European mindset at the time, it was the social Darwinism, which says basically two things. One is the evolution of mankind, and such evolution makes one group as a fit against the other group. So the survival of the fittest comes in this point. And that means that Europeans at the time were the fittest people on earth, because they had the scientific progress, economical power, and military power as well. So that legitimized their colonialism and their capabilities and their control over the other. So this kind of a mindset, a social Darwinism, created a binary world in their mindset, which is one is the central and another one is the peripheral, right? So Europe considered itself as the center of the earth, which means they were the most educated, most enlightened, and therefore they have the burden to civilize the rest of the world, and which is and thus we see the rise of the Orientalism discourse, and through this Orientalism discourse we see the other, which is the periphery part of this part. We see the other, they are the distant, savage, barbaric, exotic. So can you tell us more about this kind of mindset that the European had?
Sure, and thank you for the question, Naeem. So first of all, I would argue that it's important to realize what was the initial spark for what then becomes colonialism or colonization. In 1492, Columbus was making the proposal that there needed to be a way to reach the markets and the products of Asia by circumventing the dominant Muslim force of the Ottoman Empire. Instead of going through the Ottoman Empire and having to pay fees and tolls, etc., why not go ahead and take that matter into our own hands? In 1368, the Ming Dynasty's founder had closed off the overland Silk Road. So now it found that there was an emergence of more maritime or sea routes, This then led off an avalanche of explorers. I mean, you had Henry the Navigator, Bartolomé Diaz, Vasco da Gama, a lot of Portuguese explorers, Magellan being another one. And then Columbus wanted to go ahead and put his hat into the race and score one for Spain. And so this then became the impetus. And after all, as we all know, he thought that he'd reached Asia, which he hadn't. He'd reached the Americas instead. So that was the first motivation. How can we avoid paying the piper, so to speak? And first of all, hopefully trade with China and other forces, which were already well known and well established merchants. What they found, though, was people whom they felt were beneath them because they were not Christian, the peoples of the Americas. And remember that this then mirrored their attitudes toward Muslims. Muslims were, of course, an irredeemable people, leading, of course, to the Spanish Inquisition in Spain and their treatment there, along with the treatment of Jews, that these people were not worthy of being saved, or if they were going to be saved, they were going to save them, as you said, with the white man's burden. The purpose of actually, quote unquote, saving them by giving them Christianity was to deracinate them from their original identity and their culture. If you can dislocate people from those two very important elements of their understanding of themselves, then they become very susceptible to whatever your own control and authority is. The idea of social Darwinism is also an interesting one, because Darwin's Origin of Species doesn't come along until 1867. I would suggest that perhaps the big turn for Europe was the Industrial Revolution itself. When I mentioned that there was a tremendous amount of social engineering and reorientation that occurred, remember, before the Industrial Revolution, by and large, families were far more coherent and cohesive. The men, the women, and the children all lived on the estate of whoever was their feudal lord. They all worked together. They all lived together. Industrialization then separated the families by the men going off to work, women being in the factories, children sometimes having to work, no chance of an education. So there was an awful lot of dislocation. But perhaps the biggest consequence that happened with the Industrial Revolution that wasn't even there in the agricultural era is that human beings became to be seen as no different than a cog in the machinery. The whole idea about human beings being reduced to just machines or components within these bigger machines or factories was something that then led to, as you well described, the kind of idea of social Darwinism that exists. When Darwin came up with his studies in the Galapagos Islands, it didn't have anything to do with human beings at all. He was studying adaptation in birds and other species. But because of the mental architecture that industrialization had created, it then became usable for people to do things like making hierarchies of people, justifying it based on science, science being the new God, so to speak. Remember, it is at this time that the West has started to conquer nature. Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, manipulates pea plants to come up with the different strains and learn about genetics. You have the idea that it's no longer believed that the earth, that the sun revolves around the earth, it's the other way around. You have, as Ms. Caligara says here, you've got people like, oh, very interesting, Darwin's grandfathers being such key figures in all of this. You have the idea, and I always like to mention this, that the person for whom the Nobel Prizes is named and his endowment is Alfred Nobel, who made his fortune by inventing dynamite, trinitrotoluene. Well, why does that matter? Because think about it, when the railroads are being built, you can now no longer have to go around a mountain. You can literally then blast your way through a mountain. And mountains are not only a physical manifestation, but they are also are a metaphor. They are considered to be the one immovable object that God has created. And so if you're able to then go ahead and bore a hole through what God created, you're essentially then making the implication that you can conquer God. It's one of the reasons why Nietzsche then said in the late 19th century that, you know, God is dead, because God had become irrelevant in the West. Mankind had become enlightened. Mankind was now in a position where he could understand what before only God could. Delving into subatomic particles, looking into an atom and beyond, fed into this. So when Darwin comes around, and because it was within the realm of science, it became very easy for the notion of social Darwinism. It led to such scientific quote unquote scholarship as craniometry. The idea that the larger the skull size, the bigger the brain capacity, the bigger the intellectual, and so on. And it just so happened that the largest crania belong to Scandinavian people, and the smallest belong to the pygmies of Africa and the people of Southeast Asia. So this then becomes a justification of othering, inferiorizing, dehumanizing, conquering people. And then, of course, as Europe was going through its own spasms of secularity versus religion, saying that at least this is another motivation, we'll go ahead and civilize them, even if they don't want to, because maybe they don't know that they should be civilized with the white man's burden. It's one of the reasons why missionaries played such a big role in this whole process.
Thank you, Saeed. I think that was quite a detail, and I like that. To be honest, there are quite a number of questions in the chat. I would like you to have a quick look, if that is possible. Let me ask. There are a couple of hands over there. Let's begin with those two.
Okay.
Aziz Rahman, could you unmute yourself and make your question, please? We can't hear you, Aziz Rahman. Could you unmute yourself first, please?
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
I was the person who was asking whether you have written a book on the topic that you are covering over the 2 lectures. The reason was, to me, as a sort of, not as well aware of as you are because of an academic full sort of involvement in academic study, was that these are the points that you have brought forward are the key things that we as Muslims need to understand first, then find some strategy to overcome it if at all possible. The reason is, after the Western world was successfully able to defeat and dismantle and disorient the Muslim world, they have invented, not out of necessity, to create something orientalist of Islamic studies. The reason for me, as far as I, as a layman Muslim, ordinary Muslim, think that that study was simply, to me, to discover the underbelly of the Muslims, where they will be always targeting that there we have to hit them back if they ever try to rise back. And that has been, for a time being, was correct. But I think this sort of the Renaissance kind of thing that happened in Muslim world is going a bit past that. So on that basis, I have got several observations to agree with you and strengthen the point and a bit different as well. One is, if we say modernity is more or less defined as a democratic liberalism or neoliberalism, whatever it is, the democracy or the secularism was born out of political expediency, not from a moral or ethical viewpoint. The reason is, Westphalia was a consequence of a bitter denominational fight between them, and they saw that it only kills them. So what is the solution? Okay, leave the religion away from there. So that is how they became secular, not because they thought that this is the best way. In the same manner, after the Second World War, First World War, Second World War, the event came, Europeans said, okay, listen, we have fought and killed each other, forget about it. So, and a multilateral definition came, but we have to be a committee of nations, not a nation. So these are, to my view, are all born out of political expediency. Economically, you have mentioned, Doctor, that there was very big revolutions, which was mentioned, like Adam Smith's market economy. You even highlighted it. I would say that I do not go all the way with it. Adam Smith was simply an academic theoretician. He did not quite define that exactly this is how your economy must perform to be able to really develop yourself. But with that one, I have found that for mysterious reasons, that English from the Spain all the way to British Empire building, they found that expansion of capitalism, they have to resources, but who will be the customer? You touch the point. They did something called mercantilist economy, because the colonies they have rooted the wealth from, they did not allow the same resources to be used there and produced there, in which case the local people would have been the laborers and even small entrepreneurs, and the profit would have gone to the company, not to the state. They did not allow that. If you notice that in India, I remember one person's quotation, Prince Darkanath Thakur, it is the great grandfather of Rabindranath Tagore. He at one time was an advocate of English education, and with Lord Cornwallis, he was saying that we want to make some factories here, and those factories will produce this jute and all other things that you are taking. You don't have to do it, we'll be able to produce it. Cornwallis, being a lord and one of the suckers of the British sort of new generation of lords, he saw that if this is allowed, these people will produce these things and they will export to our country. So our country's people will become unemployed and there will be employment. So it will be the benefit of East India Company, but not my land. Here I come back to mention to you, sir, that there is a writer called Shashi Tharoor. You have seen the Inglorious Empire. He wrote to British how inglorious they were. He was saying the 43 trillions was looted from Bengal, but nothing was allowed to be produced there. The reason was, in that case, it would have been very similar to modern day globalization. If you notice that globalization, America made the biggest mistake to allow the sort of low cost production in China, and eventually China rose while they were busy defeating Muslims. So on that kind of thing, I'm feeling that, brother, that the way that these people have gone into colonialism may not be started with that one, but as soon as they saw the opportunity, they have taken all, not part of it given to them. So my definition of their colonialism is that the entire colony was my philosophy, my phrase, loot land, and their mother country will build land. They looted and built this one. That's why today, if we say that England was built by the blood and sweat and the resources of the Indian subcontinent, if not all, but major, will not be wrong. So after that, after having said that, brother, I want to come back later on about what our three giants you mentioned, Sheikh Jamaluddin Afghani, Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, and also Rashid Rida. I thought that they had some fundamental flaws because of which they did not quite show the path, although they have expressed their sentiments. But inshallah, that if I get another opportunity.
Yep.
So these are my views.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. So just very briefly on that, on these issues regarding the features of modernity and whether they are incomplete or whether they are flawed, inshallah, that's actually going to be next lecture.
Yeah, no problem.
Where we will go ahead and explore them. What are the
sorry, my microphone is not working.
Okay, could we mute that? Would that be possible? Thank you. The other thing I think to go ahead and consider, I take your point well, that there was an active suppression of not just rights, but also economic opportunity for producer colonies. Lord Cromer in Egypt actively suppressed the entry of industrial equipment into Egypt, which was a major producer of raw cotton for the textile industry of England. And Cromer knew quite well that the cotton being of high quality in Egypt, were it to be produced in Egypt by mass production, would clearly be superior to that of British made. And the other fact is that it wasn't just simply a looting situation. The British then very cynically suppressed the industry and only allowed the industrial output from England to be sold in Egypt, which of course was very humiliating at the same time, because now people were having to pay far more for cotton that actually they themselves grew. So hopefully in 2 weeks, we will go through a list of the so-called modernity characteristics and see where those flaws were in the system. So I appreciate your question. Naeem, did you want to look at another question for me?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a number of them. So if you could go straight at the top, you'll see that we've got Naomi and Wazir Baksh also.
Yep. So I see some comments, and I'll just accept the comments for what they are, and thank you for them. You're right about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and how that led to it. I think the main point that I'd like to make about some of these comments, that and Mr. Badi's comment, is that, you know, when we think about especially having suffered so much by colonialism and imperialism, it becomes very easy to think that this was a well-calculated, premeditated, sophisticated plan. And I think what you will find is that it was not necessarily that. The West, I think, came into a kind of wealth, and it came into a series of opportunities that it couldn't fathom exactly how to process that. But the idea that in 1492, all of a sudden, a few people were sitting in some chamber in Spain deciding how they were going to destroy Muslims doesn't really align with, in many cases, it was dumb luck. It was falling into the right situations. It was based on opportunism among one another, serendipity, and then also, to be fair, some very good foresight on people realizing what was going to be the next thing. I mean, think about it like this. How is it even possible that a memo written by the Lord of the Admiralty says maybe we should switch from coal to oil because it's cleaner and it's less bulky, and we don't have to then tap into our own domestic inventory of coal? This was Winston Churchill deciding on switching the Royal Navy to oil from coal. I mean, the idea that from that we have the great race for oil in the Middle East isn't necessarily explaining how all the pieces of the puzzle were put together. But thank you for those questions. Ms. Caligaro is asking, commenting on the current situations with Afghanistan and with Russia. Well, I mean, I think that we can say that these are certainly related to those inceptional points of modernity, and in many ways the characteristics are still there. This is not the first time that Afghanistan has been in the crosshairs of the West. We have to remember that back in the 19th century, Afghanistan was desired by both Russia and by Great Britain. It had really not much to do with Afghanistan itself. It had to do with the fact that Russia and the UK or Great Britain were vying for control over areas of Central Asia. So again, we see that it becomes this proxy site for European countries and their own respective rivalries. Russia, I think, is also a very fascinating country because I don't think that Western Europe has ever considered it to be fully Western. Despite the fact that Queen Victoria's grandson, the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was part British, it was still seen as foreign. It was still seen as outside the realm of Western Enlightenment, whether it was its literature or its culture. Napoleon, I think, felt the same way about it, and that's why he then tried his rather ill-fated Napoleonic Wars. As far as the current conflicts and threats, I mean, Russia with the Ukraine, this is the same Western power politics that has existed for now centuries. All that has changed is they're playing with much more sophisticated weaponry. But notice that it is becoming more and more difficult for the West to assert its values of Western modernity as a defining and distinguishing feature from places like Afghanistan and Russia. Yes, with Afghanistan, it may be a bit more convenient because the Taliban are seen as the antithesis of Western values, particularly when it comes to treatment of women, so to speak. But you don't see this argument even being broached anymore, that somehow the West is the bastion of liberal democracy as opposed to Putin's Russia. So thank you for that question. Says here, Sabri, if colonialism had to be approximated to a human personality, it would be Boris Johnson, professing equality all the while benefiting some. Yes, and I think that dovetails that last comment very nicely. Thank you. That there was a time when Western modernity was a little bit more discreet about hiding its contradictions and its paradoxes. It seems as though that's not the case anymore. And again, as we move forward in our lecture series, we will identify it not only as a major systemic flaw, but we will also then try to speculate, well, is there a tipping point where this kind of dichotomy is no longer sustainable? Recommending God's Shadow by Alan Mikhail, excellent book. Yes, thank you for that recommendation. Let's see here. Could colonialism not just be a final progression of the agricultural revolution where man starts to enslave man? Wow, that's a wonderfully Marxian analysis, I would say, and I wouldn't disagree. I think that colonialism just simply then takes on many different forms. One could make the argument that today's colonialism is driven much more by the corporation than it is by the sovereign state. 21 years ago, Norina Hertz wrote the book, The Silent Takeover, in which she made the assessment that out of the top 100 economies in the world, over half of them were no longer sovereign states, but they were in fact companies or corporations. Today, that number probably is around 2/3. So when we look at it from that calculus, we have to ask this question then, that who is arbitrating, who is controlling civil society? In the West, it used to be the church. And then, of course, you saw, as was pointed out earlier with Rahman Saab's reminder about Westphalia, it was then dismantled in favor of the nation state. Now, it could be argued that the nation state is having to yield more and more to the corporations, something which arguably began with the British East India Company and Britain in 1857. So whether that then limits the liberty of man, I suppose would be, again, a wonderful irony for a society and for an ethos which began through Enlightenment philosophy to supposedly free man from all of these structures and restrictions. We have here by Mr. Anis, how are you defining secularism when you say the West did not implement it in the colonies because they encouraged sectarianism? As it is understood, secularism is the separation of religious rulings from the governance of the society. Surely the one thing the West implemented was secularism because they did not allow for the rules of religion, God, and the governance of society. As a matter of fact, the West's whole basis of secularism and individual freedoms, ownership, belief, speech, and individual. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because where the Europeans went, they never dismantled the Sharia courts. In fact, arguably, they certainly did restrict the scope and the scale of what were the items and the cases in their jurisdiction. But at no time did they criminalize it. At no time did they delegitimize it. They left them intact. They also elevated other religious communities, religious systems for personal legal matters. Of course, that was already being done in the Ottoman Empire with the so-called millet system, which had always recognized that for religious communities, they could handle whatever matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, matters of rituals, etc., within their own communities. And in fact, they could even name their own religious authorities, and they were given the full strength and authority and backing of the Ottoman state. What we're talking about here really is a maintenance of sectarian identity, which then allows for the exploitation of the British, especially, but also other European forces like the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, and particularly the Italians as well. Let's see here. Mr. Ronan, I understand people, okay, thank you. Mr. Mahmoud, can you highlight the basic differences, if any, between imperial colonialism of the ancient period and modern age imperial colonialism? Thank you. That's a really good question. I would say that the easiest distinction to make is that the imperialism of the ancient world, and in this I would even include the Muslim world, was wherever the expansion happened as a normal consequence of imperialism, those societies were absorbed into the broader empire. And as a result, we could not consider it to necessarily be settler colonialism. It also didn't involve the kind of extraction or expulsion colonialism, which were the two examples that I gave earlier today. It was the expansion of authority, whether it was Pax Romana in the case of the Roman Empire, or Pax Islamica in the case of Islam, where it spread. There wasn't then the pillage or the rape of resources in one area to then get shifted to another. In fact, if anything, the status quo economically was maintained in many of these other empires instead of just fattening up the core. I like the point, Naeem, that you made in talking about the core and the periphery, because of course that's the architecture of Immanuel Wallerstein in his world systems theory. Here, of course, there was a core, which would be the capital, whether it was Rome or Baghdad or Damascus. But we find, though, that in all of these cases, by and large, as empires always have to struggle with, there was a process of decentralization that they could not control. Even during the Abbasids, by the time the Abbasid Empire was 200 years old, around 945, the Islamic Empire was essentially a bunch of semi-autonomous provinces. The Fatimids were ruling Egypt and Syria, for example. So the notion of exploitation was not there in the early period, but it became a hallmark feature of the modern period. So I hope that answers that question. Ms. Caligaro, the East India Company had a very strong commercial focus. Saving souls was not an interest of theirs and did not want missionaries in India. Quite right. The EIC feared that any imposition of Christianity on Indians could cause ill feeling on the part of Indians, which would jeopardize the all-important trade. The missionaries really got going in India under the Raj, under the Queen Victoria. Very true, because they were now having to govern and their focus was not clearly on economics. This was a phenomenon that actually was far more commonplace in Africa, where you find the missionary work there. Missionaries were also ones to establish schools and parallel institutions in places like the Levant, Lebanon, and Syria, in order to colonize the minds from inside, to make especially Arab Christians and also elite Arab Muslims who could afford to send their kids to these schools to start to feel as though their own values, identity was inferior to that of European powers. Let's see here. I think that's all the questions from the chat group, Naeem.
Excellent. Excellent, Saeed. I think you've done a great job in taking all those questions and comments. We are nearly at the end of this session, Saeed. I had a point, and if you could shed some light on it, you touched it briefly on new colonialism.
Yep. Can I just take the question from Ms. Aslam? Yes, you're absolutely right. Missionary schools were there. In fact, I always like to challenge students of mine who are of South Asian background. I said, go home, ask your parents or ask your grandparents if any of them studied at a school which had the name Saint in it. And by and large, at least one grandparent or one parent has that. These were the schools of the future. These were the schools of the zeitgeist. There was this idea that if we studied this, kind of like the Sir Saeed model, we'll have a leg up on things. Of course, the opportunity cost was forming a colonized mind. So I'm sorry, go ahead about neocolonialism, Naeem.
Yeah, I mean, according to Hardit and Nagri, empire now establishes no territorial center of power and does not rely on fixed boundaries or barriers. It is a decentered apparatus of rule that progressively incorporates the entire global realm within its open, expanding frontiers. So, so is it the big techs, Google, Facebook, and Twitters, are they the new East India companies? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think even more so, look at the relationship that they have with the sovereign state and vice versa. Facebook has more subscribers in India than the entire population of the United States. 350 million Facebook users in India. The population of the United States is 330 million. Yeah, 350 million, 330 million. Why would Facebook go ahead and impose restrictions to then dissuade people to be on Facebook in India? So if you're looking at these debates that are happening about access and about content, that's driving everything. And at the same time, you've got a place like China. China, because of its centralized government, has the ability to tell Google and all, you want access to 1.4 billion people? You're not going to be able to say X, Y, and Z. So again, what we're finding then is in the modern, or in the current, I should say, spasms of neocolonialism, it's no longer what we saw happening in that one graphic with the vultures and the bear and the dragon, where it was sovereign states versus sovereign states. Now we have company against company, we have country against country, and we have company against country. So it's almost like playing a game of three-dimensional chess in understanding how these dynamics work. Where it's convenient, a company all of a sudden remembers where it's incorporated and then will insist on its country or the government of that country to act on its behalf against another country or company.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. I really wanted you to comment on digital ethnography or the way they are harvesting data, but I don't want to go in there at the moment. I hope you will look into or answer this question in upcoming lectures.
I will take Ms. Aslam's question. Is neocolonialism the Dajjal incarnate? Wow. So I'm actually going to say not neocolonialism. I think if you're looking for a Dajjal, I think I would look into the realm of AI. You know, some of the predictions about that Dajjal will create a statue that comes to life and that people will worship it. I think that that's starting to happen with current technology, arguably. Dajjal may not be a person, but its manifestations may well be. So let's see. I would say AI perhaps more than neocolonialism as far as if you're looking at an abstract. But again, it's something that I would have to explore more. Ms. Caligari says, Shashi Tharoor told me that he studied under Jesuits and rated them very highly. Shashi's sister told me that he attended a Loreto nun school in Calcutta, descendants of Dr. Yeah, I'm glad that you interacted with him. I got a chance to a couple of years ago as well. It's amazing where he acquired his accent and that just remarkable diction and lexicon. Again, I find Shashi to be a fascinating individual because earlier Mr. Rahman mentioned Edward Said, and I think that these figures that we look at, and Orientalism is a very important topic to study. In fact, I'm teaching a course this term called Orientalism and Occidentalism in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think we have to be honest about individuals like Edward Said and Shashi Tharoor, that when they offer a critique of the West, And we, of course, are all in that same boat. How immune are we from the ability to be called Orientalist? It doesn't matter anymore where we are geographically. It's the recognition and the realization that our entire system globally now is a Western zeitgeist. The fact that we're conducting this in English, I think, is at the very baseline that we are speaking a language of colonialism. We do so thinking that it is benign. We think that it has no consequence, but I'm sure there's something there. For those of you who are fans of the Harry Potter series, you're familiar with the whole idea about the Horcrux. We have to ask ourselves, are these sort of Horcruxes that colonialism and Western modernity place into us? And then how do we interact with them? That's not looking at it from a moral perspective. It's just looking at it from a reality. I take it as, again, one of those fixed points of reference in my life. I don't look at colonialism through a moral lens as a historian, because it's above my pay grade to moralize these issues. Maybe in a private conversation, that's a whole different story. But I think it's important as we move forward, and as Mr. Rahman had also mentioned, that when it comes to strategies of dealing with Western modernity, it's important to understand then what are all the forces that are not only working on it, but are working on us wherever we might live. Because the internet is certainly very Western. It is very white. It is very English or Anglophone, and we have to take those into account. It's like watching or reading a newspaper or watching a news item. If you know what the biases are of the editorial page, you may not agree with it, you may not like it, but at least you can understand it a lot better. Shashi Tharoor set up the first PG Wodehouse Society in the world in India. Why am I not surprised? And PG Wodehouse, I mean, Jeeves and Wooster, what wonderful literature. If anyone hasn't read Wodehouse, it's a nice way to spend a weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Naomi and everybody who commented on the comment section and raised the questions. And thank you, Professor. You've taken a lot of questions and comments, and taken a lot of time in answering those things. With regard to the colonial language that we are talking, actually, the Ngugi wa Thiong'o in the end left the colonial English language and started writing on his local African language. So that actually gives us a bit of impetus that to consider a way of decolonizing our mind or our language. So I think we just have touched the tip of the iceberg with regards to the topic. I think there are quite a lot to discuss and talk about in future. But today we've run out of our time, and hopefully in coming lectures we'll be able to touch upon some of those topics as well. So we thank you so much, Professor Saeed. We thank everybody for making comments. Our next lecture will be on 10th February. The title would be Systematic Flaws of Modernity and its Application by the Islamicate, Political, Cultural, and Ideological Interventions. More details will be shared shortly in our WhatsApp group, so feel free to join in if you haven't done it yet. Again, we thank.
Also, Naeem, I'm sorry to interrupt, but somebody had asked for, I think, maybe one of the graphics. Please feel free to share a copy of this picture. I think Ms. Aslam asked for it. I'm not sure which pictures, but please make the slides available. Or if Ms. Aslam, if you'd like to go ahead and email me, I'll be happy to send it along to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will share details in our WhatsApp group. So please feel free to join in there.
She wants to bear in the line. I'll tell you what. Before we sign off, I'll just go ahead and post my. I'll give her my email address so that she can then just contact me, and I'll send it to her.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we thank you, Professor Saeed, for delivering the lecture, and we also thank everyone for taking part and making valuable comments and questions in the Q&A section. We are very much looking forward to seeing you in our next lecture. And with that, we are closing our session tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining with us. We'll see you in our next lecture. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.